Hi everyone, we're gonna get started in a minute. But in the meantime, checking in the chat. Okay, we're recording. Yes, there's gonna be an attendance sheet at the end, but I just wanna acknowledge that we're gonna be talking about sexual violence and domestic sexual violence today. And it can be really triggering for folks. So if at any point you need to take a break, if you need to step back, that's totally fine. Do whatever you gotta do to make yourself feel okay. Also, I wanna remind y'all that we are, Luis and I are both mandated reporters, right? Which means that, and Luis is your chat monitor this evening. What that means is that if you tell us that you are being hurt, that someone is hurting you, that you're hurting yourself, or that you are hurting somebody else, we have to report that, right? And that's just for your safety, for your well-being. We really want to make sure that if you are experiencing any type of violence, that violence stops. So if you want to tell us something, just know that we would have to report that probably. If you don't want to tell us anything, you can call the 24-hour hotline, which maybe Luis, can you find and put in the chat? So this is going to bring up some stuff for folks, right? Sexual violence is a very common, pervasive issue in our community. It's an epidemic, right? Lots of folks are experiencing this. So it's common for this to bring up stuff for us, right? So if you want to talk to someone afterwards, you can call the 24-hour hotline. And again, just reminding y'all that you can take whatever space you need. If you need to tap out, if you say this is too heavy for me, I have to leave, or like even just, I mean, I'm on your computer screen. You can mute me whenever, I won't be offended. So you can mute me, walk away, like do whatever you gotta do to make yourself feel okay. So that's my little disclaimer. So the first thing I want you to do is, and I don't know, this may not be possible, but how many of y'all have a sibling, a friend, anybody in your space right now that you can partner up with for an activity? Anybody? If you have someone in your space, what I want you to do is grab them and bring them next to you. And if you don't worry. Luis and I guess we can demonstrate virtually. But what we're going to do is a little activity. And so again, it's better if you have a partner in your space. So a sibling, whoever, if you have anybody. Your little sister will probably yell at you. Yeah, little sisters do that. But if you can grab them, I want one of you, so you're gonna partner up, one of you is gonna hold a fist. So Luis, can you hold a fist for me real quick? Okay, so have someone hold up a fist. You can do it, or you can have your sibling do it. And then the next thing I want you to do is one of you has to try to open the fist, right? So Luis is holding his fist. What would I do if Luis and I were in person right now and I wanted to open his fist? I'd probably I'd go for the thumb first, and I'd try to wriggle that free. And then I'd try to hook my hand underneath and grab. Anyway, how would you open Luis's fist? Or if you're with someone, how would you open the fist? What would be your tactic to open Luis's fist? Throw it in the chat. I'm here, I'm present. Go for the palm of the hand. Okay, yeah. What would be your tactic to open Luis's fist? Throw it in the chat. Finger by finger. Okay. I go for the ring finger because the pinky follows. Okay, yeah. Pull his finger.
I'm keeping track of the chat if you want to.
Okay. Sorry.
So yeah, I'll grab his wrist.
What would you do? How would you open Luis's fist? Please show them your fist.
The ring finger. Ring finger. I can't see myself, that's why. Oh, there you go.
Okay, these are some good answers. So I heard like there's a lot of different tactics involved, right? Like people are like going for the pinky, going for the ring
Good
finger.
morning.
What?
Yeah, the attendance is on the way. Sorry. Karen's getting the attendance before asking.
Yes, it'll be thrown in there in a second. So yes, okay, so ring finger. Anyway, did anybody in the chat, Luis, say they would ask you to open it?
No.
Okay, so no one thought to say, hey, Luis, can you open your fist, right? Luis, if I asked you to open your fist, would you do it? Are you comfortable doing so?
Yeah, because this is uncomfortable.
Okay, so you would open it, right? This is just a stupid little activity, a fun little activity to show how removed we are from this idea of consent, right? Like we never ask for consent. We never think to ask for consent. A lot of what y'all were talking about is like forcing his hand open, right? Like you were thinking of coming up with different schemes, different ways you would try to force his fist open. And, you know, while that might work, maybe the easiest way and the most comfortable way would have been to just ask him to open his fist, right? So yes, so consent is really, really important, and consent is not something we talk about a lot, and it's not something that we even practice that often. And today we're going to be really talking about consent in terms of sexual activity. But I just like to use that as an example because it's important that we realize that consent is actually something that's present in our everyday lives, right? And we should normalize asking for consent in little activities and in day-to-day. I mean, I think about like when we used to go to the office and I never just hug anybody, right? Like I always have to ask them for a hug first. I don't think we'll ever return to office hugging maybe anytime soon, but who knows? But when it does happen, you gotta ask. Okay, so that's my little activity. So in order to, like, we haven't really gotten to consent yet, but that's just a little activity. And right, like sexual violence is something where consent is not present. But I wanna ask y'all, what comes up for you? Like, what is sexual violence? When you hear the term sexual violence, what comes to your mind?
Abuse, touching, forced sexual actions, rape, repetitive sexual abuse, rape.
Yeah. Okay.
Whips in courts.
Wait, what?
Whips in courts. Unwanted sexual advances, actions of no consent, and abuse of power, sexuality.
Okay, great answers. So yeah, there's a lot. So as you can see, even in those responses, there's a lot of images, a lot of examples that come up when we hear the term sexual violence. And so what I want, we always do this in our sessions, is I want us to all be working with the same idea of what this means, right? So for this, when we talk about sexual violence is actually an umbrella term that covers a few different types of violence, right? So under this umbrella of sexual violence is included sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and stalking. And sorry, my dog's distracting me. So let's talk about all of these different terms, right? So, but under this like umbrella of sexual violence, that's what's included. What is sexual assault? When we hear the term sexual assault, what comes up for folks?
I'm waiting for some answers here. So as soon as I see them, I'll let you go.
So what I'm trying to do is I want us to distinguish the difference, look at the difference between sexual assault and sexual abuse.
Wait, I thought I just answered that. Unwanted physical sexual advances.
Unwanted sexual advances, yeah.
Saying something sexual to somebody.
Saying something sexual, yeah. Okay, so sexual assault would be something like a one-time incident of sexual violence, right? So that would be something like a date rape, right? Where someone puts something into your drink and violates you. Sexual assault would also be something like a stranger rape, right? Like if something happens on your way home, right? A stranger. Sexual abuse is something that's ongoing, right? So it's something that's repetitive. So an example of sexual abuse would be something like any type of sexual violence in a relationship, right? That's like ongoing and happens multiple times. That would also look like any type of child sexual abuse, because usually child sexual abuse happens when a child by like a family member or a neighbor or somebody, and it happens multiple times. So that's the difference, right? Like sexual assault is a one-time incident. Sexual abuse is something that's ongoing. Then we have this term sexual harassment. So what is sexual harassment? And I actually heard it, I think it was one of the first responses, so I can actually just say it's unwanted sexual attention, right? Sexual advances. And sexual harassment, we often talk about sexual harassment in like the workplace, right? So like this is what was very popular to talk about during the Me Too movement in 2017, which I'll go into later. But sexual harassment is also something that happens on the streets, right? Like, I don't know about y'all, but like when I'm walking down the street and someone's catcalling, that's sexual harassment, right? Any like leering, like someone staring. What?
Yeah, catcalling. Saying catcalling, trafficking. It happens in schools.
It happens in school. Oh, that was my next point. Amazing, right? So like sexual harassment is something that happens in schools, right? Usually when we're in a school environment, our teachers or administrators or the principal calls it bullying, but it's actually sexual harassment, right? Like having any classmates comment on your body, right? I used to work at a school where there was Grab Ass Friday, right? Where usually boys would, like, it was like a game, boys would play and see how many asses they could grab. Obviously female, because homophobia is rampant. Right, but sexual harassment is present in like any environment.
Yeah, when I was going to school, I remember I was in 6th grade and somebody would jump and then shove their face, mostly a male, into another male's crotch. And that was a game. I used to get annoyed at it.
Yeah, there's like so many examples of this. Any, like, I think about like during PE class, like any type of locker room, like weird harassment, like commenting on women's breath, like all this stuff. Like, and again, sexual harassment can happen between two people of the opposite sex, between two people of the same sex, or between like a non-binary person. Like, again, like the most vulnerable folks of any types experiencing any types of violence are vulnerable communities, including like non-binary women, but it can also be male on male as well. And then they'll say like no homo afterwards, as if that is a thing, which is homophobic. Okay, then we have stalking. So stalking is under the sexual violence umbrella. Why do you think I put why did I put stalking under the sexual violence umbrella? Why do you think?
Unwanted attention can be violent. It can lead to sexual violence.
Nice. Okay, so yes, so stalking often or many times, not always, but usually the goal is sexual assault, right? And what's also very interesting about stalking is most of the time, stalking is perpetrated, the person doing the stalking is a former or current partner of the person they're stalking, right? So what we're going to be talking about a lot today is like all these myths around these experiences that kind of cloud our vision and make us like fuck up our ability to see things for what they are, right? So if stalking is something that's usually done by a former partner or a current partner, what's the myth around stalking? The myth is usually like someone hiding in a bush at night, right? And like leering through a window. And while that happens, of course, like stranger stalking happens, it happens a lot with celebrities or well-known figures, right? And it can happen to any of us. Actually, it's more likely that you'll be stalked by a former partner, and it's usually when you're trying to break the relationship, right? So like now we're connecting it back to domestic violence. And what's important about that is if we believe in these myths around stalking, we don't get the justice we deserve, right? So we had a client years ago who was being stalked by her ex-boyfriend, and what he would do is he would send her roses every day. No matter, she had broken off the relationship and she had moved to another building, and he still sent her roses every day. She went to the police to report this, and the police reaction was, you're coming in to complain and report someone giving you flowers? Like, you're like lucky you have someone like being romantic to you, right? Like, what's wrong with you? Like, they're just trying to like win you back, right? So like all these myths have real effects on how seriously these acts of violence are taken. The other thing that's really important that we understand about sexual assault is that 80% of sexual assaults are committed by an acquaintance. And what I mean by acquaintance is someone the victim knows, right? So that could be a partner, that could be a classmate, that could be a coworker, a neighbor. So 80% of the time it's committed by someone we know. And like, think about the myth around sexual violence now. The myth around sexual violence is usually, right, like sexual violence is committed, again, like always at night. All these types of violence only happen at night, apparently, according to our myths. At night, when you're walking alone in a dark alley, like by someone with a weapon, right? Like, these are the myths around sexual violence. And again, I'm not saying that can't happen, that does happen. But 80% of the time, it's very close to where the victim lives, and if not where they live, and it's by acquaintance, someone they know, right? So that's important that we distinguish too. Okay.
And we're still working on the science sheet. If for you are asking, sorry, our colleague is getting it to us.
Wow, y'all don't even care about what I'm saying. All you care about is attendance sheet. Breaks my heart. Just kidding. Okay, so we've defined sexual violence, right? And one of the most pervasive types of sexual violence is rape. So what is rape? Rape is when a person is forced, coerced, or manipulated into participating into a sexual activity they have not consented to, right? And so that can happen between a man and a woman. It can happen between a non-binary person and a man and a woman, right? Like, it can happen to anybody. And there's actually a specific type of syndrome, disorder, that folks who experience rape can have, right? So we have right here, rape trauma syndrome is the psychological trauma experienced by a sexual violence rape survivor. And rape trauma syndrome obviously sounds very similar to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And they're very similar in a lot of ways, but they're also very different in some ways. So I wanted us to cover some of these responses to sexual violence. So mental or emotional responses can include depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, disassociation, fear of being alone, difficulty concentrating, nightmares or flashbacks, hypervigilance, and forgetfulness. Some of the behavioral or physical ones include drug or alcohol abuse, self-harm, hypersexual activity, difficulty engaging in sexual activity, recanting the incident, so taking it back, contacting the assailant, contacting the person who did this to you, nausea, hysteria, insomnia. Okay, so when we're looking at all of these responses that one person can have to sexual violence, what do we notice about these responses? Do we notice anything?
They're intense. They are intense.
Yes, they are intense.
Anything? They're in the same category.
What does that mean? They're in the same category?
And remember to keep adding questions to the Q&A. We only have one so far. It can eventually lead to physical mental harm.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them involve self-loathing.
Mm-hmm.
Like the same symptoms.
Right. So yeah, they're very intense. They're very serious. They're nothing to be laughed at, right? Like, because especially it's very common for us to say, get over it. It wasn't that bad when something like this happens. But what I always like to point out as well is that a lot of these are opposites, right? So someone might be hyper vigilant, right? Which means they're like very hyper aware. They're overly aware of everything. They're paying attention to everything very closely, right? They're like on edge, just like making sure they're aware of everything that's going on. And then another one is forgetfulness, like forgetting everything, not remembering what happened to you. Like waking up and be like, how did I get here? Or like walking to the kitchen and all of a sudden be like, wait, why did I come to the kitchen? Right? Like all these things. Another two that are opposites are like hypersexual activity, so engaging in lots of sex, compared to another response is not being able to engage in sex at all, right? One is disassociation, right? So like kind of being disconnected. There's isolation, right? Like you don't want to see anybody, you don't want to talk to anybody. And then the other is fear of being alone. So you're going to be like extra wanting to surround yourself with people all the time. And what's really important that we notice when we have these very opposite, very different responses to one act of sexual violence, that means that one day, one person can experience a rape and be forgetting all the details and be like very numb and not having any emotions. And then another person can experience the exact same thing and like remember everything that happened step by step. Remember the time, be like at 11:07, like this is where I was. And they may be hysterical, like crying, all this stuff. Two people experience the same thing and have two completely different reactions. That's really important. Both of those reactions are valid. Both of those reactions are normal. Both of those people are reacting to a trauma that they experienced. Just because two people react differently to the same act of violence does not mean one of them's lying, right? And this is the thing. So many victims of sexual violence have different reactions, and these different reactions are usually used as an excuse or to poke holes in their stories, right? And well, it's important that I show you this slide so that you understand that it doesn't matter how you react. We all react to survive. And just because two people have different reactions doesn't mean one's lying, right? Like, and that may seem very obvious to you. Yeah.
Sorry, and if you have any questions, I see some questions here on the chat. Just make sure to add them to the Q&A so we could answer them later. Please. Thank you.
So, right, like we would never, I don't think we really do this, right? So say two people lived in the same apartment building near the World Trade Center on 9/11, right? Maybe they both lost somebody. We would never go up to them and be like, I don't know, I think you're lying. I don't think you lost anybody. I don't think you're traumatized from that, right? We would never do that because we would say, oh, they're both experiencing different responses. It's very normal. But with rape victims, we suddenly start questioning every response they have. And again, that's why I really want us to see that the responses can be all over the map. They can be contradictory. One day you could be in hysterics, the next day you can feel nothing and be laughing, right? It doesn't matter. Every response is natural and normal. Okay. Any comments that I should deal with first? No? Okay. So here are some of the myths like I've been talking about, right? If women didn't dress slutty, they wouldn't get raped, right? That's a huge one. Like, but oftentimes people respond to someone saying they were raped by saying, what were you wearing? Like, where were you? Like, what? Oh, you were at that bar? Oh, you went to a frat house? You know you shouldn't go to a frat house, right? Like, you're just asking to be raped if you go to a frat house, right? It doesn't matter what you're wearing. Sexual violence is not about you being sexy or tantalizing, right? Like no one rapes someone because you're like, they just can't control themselves. People rape because of power and control, right? People rape because it gives them a sense of power and control. Women lie about rape for fame and money, also not true. The amount of women or people that lie about a sexual assault, do we know what percent that is? How many reports of sexual violence end up being false? Throw that in the chat. Do we know what percent?
Less than 1%, 2%.
It's 2%. Right?
Yay.
Yay. You win a car. Okay. No, I don't have cars to give out. I'm sorry. But yes, only 2% of reports, and these are police reports, end up being false. And actually, it is probably less because most people, lots of times what happens, people take their case back. They say, I changed my mind. If they're intimidated, right? If they start realizing like what the legal process is. Also, I don't know about everybody else, but if you're paying attention to what's going on, do you think a lot of people would be like, you know what, I'm gonna walk into a police station. Police are great. Police are amazing. I'm just gonna walk into a police station and report this crime because I love them and I know they're gonna support me through this, blah, 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 blah. I don't know. I think most of us try to avoid police by any means necessary. I mean, I could be wrong. But right? Like it's not a fun thing to lie about rape. And you don't get money and you don't get fame, right? Okay. Men can't be raped is another myth, which is false. Men are sexually assaulted. The stats are actually 1 in 3 women will be raped and 1 in 6 men. And we know statistics, how statistics work. I think those are much higher actually, but men can be raped. Rape is just bad or rough sex. No, rape is not bad sex. Also rough sex, any like type of like BDSM or playful violence during sex needs to be communicated beforehand, right? Like that's the key about that. Men can't help it if they get turned on. Again, it's not about lack of self-control, right? It's about power and control. And what's key to this too is like,
and there's some comments here some people are making. It says also I don't know the name of the people who accuse celebrities of sexual assault, so how would they get clout?
Well, my favorite example, and it's changed a little bit this year, but love him, but Kobe Bryant, right? Kobe Bryant was accused of sexual violence. What was her name? What was the name of the woman? People often say that like that bitch lied for money and fame. And I always go, first of all, she got no money. Second of all, what's her name? And no one knows her name, right? Yes, any other comments? Luis?
Sorry. Yeah. I hear. Maybe the person may be feeling confident after the incident, and they decide to turn to the police, but they make the person feel worse since they don't do much to help.
Great example. That happens a lot, right? They might say, like, I can't believe this happened to me. And the only idea of justice we have is the criminal justice system, right? So they may feel like going, and then the police themselves aren't very nice about it either, right?
Someone here says, I hear misconceptions about people saying sexual assault victims just want to tear down big celebrities, and I'm not quite sure how to tackle those comments now.
Oh, well, hopefully after today you'll have more idea of how to have this conversation. We also, like this week, on Thursday, I'm doing media and violence. So we're going to be talking more about this. So this isn't just the only time. Okay, so anything else, or can I move on?
I think we could, if y'all have anything else, just add it to the questions so we could kind of get going.
Yes, if actually, can we take a 1 minute break? I just need to go pee.
Okay.
I can't. And then we can start up again. And so if in the meantime, just throw your questions and take this time to throw your questions into the chat. Okay, I'll be right back.
Hey everybody, sorry, I'll keep you all entertained here. So yeah, I'm waiting for Hannah. This is hard to do from a laptop, as computer, because we are in a home environment. But hopefully, y'all are enjoying this thing, and I'll be doing another workshop on next week. Yeah, this is true about Christine. Now Kavanaugh is, in the Supreme Court and whatnot. So yes.
Okay, I'm back. I'm gonna fast peer. Okay. Okay. So those are some of the myths, right? So here I have my little statistics that I was just saying, right? Like 1 in 3 women. Sorry, my dog is in the way. Can you move, ma'am? Ma'am? She's not moving. Okay. 1 in 3 women, right? 1 in 6 men. So it's an epidemic, right? It's huge. It's not going away. It's a huge problem. And part of the reason is those myths. So why is this happening? Right? We're here talking about sexual violence, and we're talking about how many people are experiencing this. So why is this happening? Well, I have the answers. So one of the reasons, right, is gender roles, which Karen and y'all talked about a little bit. We're going to do it briefly again. The other is affirming identities and sexual orientation. And then the other is consent. So how many of y'all learned about consent in school? Throw it in the chat.
Nope, not really. Nope. No. Nuh-uh. No.
No, okay.
7th and 8th grade, 1 person. Nope.
1 person. Oh, okay. That's not great. That's not a great look, right? So yes, so we don't learn about consent, right? I didn't learn fully all the ins and outs of consent until I was in my 20s, right? So you have to learn about consent in order for consent to happen, right? It's crazy. Okay. So one of the reasons, right, and this is, there's studies, the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, which is our main government organization, right, that looks at diseases and the spreading of diseases. And you're probably like, why is Hannah talking about diseases right now when we're talking about sexual violence? Well, just you wait. The CDC did a study a while ago, and they looked at communities and their levels of sexual violence and domestic violence. And what they found is that in communities that had more strict adherence or belief in gender roles, there were higher levels of sexual violence and domestic violence, right? Like hugely, much higher. So basically what that shows us is that if we believe that there are two genders, men and women, girls and boys, right? There's only two, and that you have to fit into certain categories in order to be a boy or a girl, then we are going to be more violent in our actions. And especially when those beliefs are held by a community and taught in a community, we are more likely to experience higher levels of interpersonal violence, domestic and sexual violence, right? So while I know we've talked about this a lot, because this is such a huge study that shows how much this lends itself to more violence, we have to talk about this. So we have this activity, right, called the gender box activity. So in this box, I have girls, right? And inside this box, I want us to list, so throw these into the chat. What are characteristics or what are like our expectation of girls in our society? What do we tell girls they should be, right? So what are some examples of these characteristics? And throw them in the chat.
The caregivers: easy, small, beautiful, submissive, pretty moms. Quiet, passive,
Yeah.
caring, feminine, respectful.
Okay, great. That's it, right? And these messages are sent to us in all types of ways, right? Through what we're taught growing up by our parents or our guardians or our caregivers, what we're taught in school, what we read, the media we watch, the magazines we buy, all this stuff. So, right, like we're told that we should be a certain way. If a girl is not these things, right? If a girl does not have these characteristics, what do we call them, right? So say a girl is strong, say a girl is sporty, say a girl is vocal, what do we label them? And this would go on the outside.
Tomboy, bossy, off, annoying.
All right, you are being very gentle with your words. I would say bitch.
Cold,
frigid, right? I would get slut, right? All these things. If a girl isn't quiet, if a girl isn't well dressed, if a girl wears too much makeup, if she doesn't wear enough makeup, if she dresses in pants and crop tops as opposed to a nice dress that covers all her butt, like, right, she's called all these things, labeled all these things, and those would go on the outside, right? What about boys? What are some characteristics? What do we tell boys in our society that they should be?
Strong, powerful, be a man, strong, respectful, a leader, smart.
Yep.
Strong, masculine, don't be a pussy.
Okay, so when a boy is not strong, when a boy does not have a lot of sex, or a man doesn't have a lot of sex, right? Like when a man is skinny, when a man actually likes looking after children and wants to be a stay-at-home dad, what do we label them on the outside?
A wuss, lazy, loser.
Yes.
Loser. I'm getting triggered here.
Okay, sorry. Okay, right?
Weak.
So here, I won't make you read those anymore.
Let's go, mess around. Not a working man.
Right. So here I have my gender boxes, right? Like in these boxes is what we're told we have to be. And on the outside are the insults we are labeled when we don't fit into that box, right? And by labeling us these things when we aren't these characteristics that we're supposed to be, it's society and our community trying to put us back into the box, right? So like if a girl is strong and wants to run for president and isn't into cooking and dish cleaning and all these things, right? She's gonna get labeled a slut, a dyke, a skank, right? And that's society's way of trying to put us back. Say, oh, you've stepped outside your box, now go back inside, right? So this is the way that our society kind of tries to determine or control how we behave, right? And who we are and how free we are. And like these are messages are sent before we're even born. Think about gender reveal parties, right? What's the point of a gender reveal party, right? A gender reveal party is like, oh, the cake is pink. That means we should buy dolls, we should buy dresses, we should paint the room pink, right? All these things. And those are ways that we tell girls how they're supposed to be. When the cake is blue, we say, okay, we're gonna paint the baby's room blue. We're going to buy them trucks and soldiers, and we're going to buy them a football. Now, when a boy picks up the doll, right, they're labeled weak, pussy, whatever. Again, so this is how these messages are pushed upon us. The other thing, right, like I mentioned, is gender identity. So we've been talking about gender in this gender box, and gender is one thing, but sex is another, right? So I have here the genderbread person. So there are a few different things, right? Like gender, these are all a spectrum, not one or the other, right? So sex is what genitalia we have, right? And that can be a penis, a vagina. It can also be something in between, right? Like it can be, there's all these different makeups, and that would be asexual, right? Like when there's genitalia that is not fully a penis, not fully a vagina. Then we have our identity. That's who we feel we are, we think we are, right? I wake up thinking I'm a woman, right? I wake up and I know that I'm a woman, right? I mean, who knows? Anyone could feel differently, right? Like, and so you can have sex, genitalia, like if you have a penis and you feel like you're a woman, you are a woman, then that would be someone who's trans, right? Then there's expression, and we're gonna do more of this later, so I'm just going quickly, and I know if you have questions, that's great. I'm just gonna go quickly because we haven't even talked about consent yet. Whew. Okay, so expression is how you express your identity, right? Your chosen identity. So that can be how you dress, like do you express yourself with masculinity or femininity, right? And then attraction is who are you attracted to? Who do you want to bone, right? Great. And then we have consent. So what is consent? Right, so we've talked about how sexual violence is so pervasive, is an epidemic in our society. And that's because of three things, right? That's because of gender roles. That's because of lack of affirming of sexuality and genders. And then there's because of consent. So what is consent?
Was consent an enthusiastic, willing yes, permission, being gentle, the permission?
Okay.
An agreement between both parties?
Yes, it's permission. Okay, so we're actually going to work through this a little bit, right? So we are not taught consent. I asked y'all how many of y'all were taught consent in school. Most of you, 99% of you said no, you weren't. But consent is something, again, that we need to practice every day. But how do we practice it if we don't know what it is? So the best way I've found in talking about this is talking about what consent is and talking about what it is not. right? So first, let's look at what consent is. Consent is permission, right? I've heard a lot of those as answers. So how do you get permission? You ask, right? Can I touch you? Can I, like, do you want to have sex? Anything like that. And then if the person says yes, here we go, right? That is affirmative consent. Affirmative and active, that's what consent is. Consent is affirmative and active. What that means is it's ongoing, right? It's live. You cannot sign a contract away giving your consent, right, before you do something. It's something that you check in on regularly, and it's something that you check on every step of the way, right? So like, just because someone consents to kissing does not mean they consent to groping, right? Just because they consent to having oral sex does not mean they consent to having penetrative sex, right? So that's why we have to check ongoing and make sure we are checking in with each other, seeing where we're at. And so that's what makes it active and affirmative, right? Like, it's a yes. I heard someone say enthusiastic, right? Affirmative and enthusiastic are kind of the same thing, right? And what that means is that consent, while someone can say yes, they may not mean yes, right? And this is important because oftentimes there's coercion, right? Where someone wears someone down until they say yes. So if you want to have sex with someone and you keep asking them and you keep asking them and they say no, and then you keep asking, and then finally they say, you know what, fine, yes. Is that enthusiastic? No, right? And the key is we should want to have sex with people that want to have sex with us, right? Crazy idea. But why would you want to have sex with someone who's not into you, right? That doesn't feel good, right? Like, sex is supposed to feel good. So we want someone that's enthusiastic about it, excited to have sex with us. Consent is revocable, meaning it can be given and taken away at any point, right? So we can be on a date and I can say, yeah, I'm down to fuck, right? Because that's how people talk on dates. And then, right, like after our nightcap or whatever, I change my mind, and that's totally fine, right? Someone can go to your home, right? Like, you can be out on a date. I mean, no one goes out on dates anymore because of COVID, but whatever. Pretend it's the normal world. And then you can invite them up to your place, and they can say yes. And then they go, you know what, actually, I've changed my mind. And you have to respect that, right? You cannot be like, no, but you promised, right? Like, no, but you said you would, right? Like, the point is someone can give their consent and take it away at any point. Consent is based on equal power. So consent cannot be given if there's a huge inequality of power, right? So if your boss asks to have sex with you, if your teacher asks to have sex with you, if someone much older asks to have sex with you, if someone who's in a much more powerful position, so a famous person, right? A powerful person, that's not an equal power and control, right? So consent cannot be given. And that's also really important because, again, just because you say yes does not mean you're fully giving consent if there's an imbalance of control, if it's coercion, right? And the key thing with consent is that yes means yes, right? No means no is a really annoying phrase that gained a lot of popularity a few years ago. But no means no implies that someone, well, they didn't say no, they didn't say stop, right? And we want to get away from that, I'm just going to keep pushing until the person stops me mentality, right? We want it to be something that's communicated, something that both people agree to and both affirm, right? So that's what yes means as opposed to no means no. Any questions so far about that? I mean, there's a lot of questions in the Q&A.
Just 7.
But any comments that I should check out first?
Yeah, so there's everyone saying like at the end, in the Q&A, just ask questions. We're adding them to the end.
Yeah, we'll do them. Okay. So yes, okay, so that's what consent is. Now, what is consent not? Consent is not.
What is not consent?
What?
I was looking for some of the comments, sorry.
When someone says no or something similar, like stop, and then you keep going, that is not consent, right? Consent is not just because someone's silent, right? Below you see the star, silence does not equal consent. And again, that's what we're trying to make folks understand, right? Is that it's not just pushing until someone stops you, right? Because also what's key is that people can be silent for a few different reasons. They can be silent because they're scared, right? Because there's an imbalance of power and control. They could be silent because they're asleep or unconscious, right? And so you cannot give consent when you're asleep or unconscious. This one seems pretty obvious, but people don't believe that, right? Brock Turner was a famous case in Stanford. Brock Turner was a student at Stanford who took a drunk woman who was unconscious at the time and penetrated her with his hands. And, you know, he argued that she had consented. And the point, like, how could she's unconscious? And even if she said yes beforehand when she was sober and then she's unconscious, you can't have sex with someone who's not fully there, right? If you're not able to understand what consent is, you cannot give consent. That means, like, if there's a language barrier, a learning barrier, a cultural barrier, right? Like, we have to be clear about what consent is. It's not under threat or coercion, right? So you can't say, do this or else, like, I'll hurt you, right? And it's also not when you wear someone down. That's what coercion means, right? It's like you keep asking and asking and manipulating your way into them saying yes. The age of consent in California is 18, so you cannot give consent if you're under the age of 18, right? And I'm not an idiot. I know people under the age of 18 are fucking, and that's okay, right? But it's important that you know that if you're under the age of 18 in California, because that law is there for your protection, right? Because as someone who's young, you are part of a vulnerable population, and adults can take advantage of children, right? And young folks. So that's there for your protection. It's not under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Any amount of drugs or alcohol, you cannot give consent, right? Because drugs and alcohol make you do things you wouldn't normally do, right? Did you want to say something, Luis?
Yeah, in California, it's you can't give consent if someone's intoxicated, even beyond the limit. And it's a little bit tricky because when people go on dates, they mostly drink beforehand. So navigating that is also, and what that means, you know. But like Hannah said, is there to protect you in case something happens.
Yes, so it's right. So in California, any amount of drugs or alcohol, you cannot consent. And that is there again for folks' protection, right? Because alcohol is the #1 date rape drug, right? People like are scared of pills being dropped into their drinks, of all this stuff, right? And while that of course happens and is a very big issue, alcohol is the #1 most legal form of date rape, right? Because you feed someone drinks and then they do something they wouldn't usually do, right? And so that's not to say, right, like we know that people can have a glass of wine at dinner and then go home and have sex and they're okay, right? But again, it's there for your protection, so that if anything happens to you while you're under the influence, it's there technically for your protection, right? So yeah, it's important that you have a relationship with the person before you engage in sex that's involves alcohol or drugs. So of course, it's not when there's an imbalance of power and control, and then silence does not equal consent. Okay, so that's what consent is and what it is not. And in California, it's in the penal code, right? It's legal. There's a consent law that basically abides by all of this, includes all of this, right? So this isn't just something we're making up, this is real. And so a lot of what I get often is like, oh my God, consent is lame. It's going to, you want me to ask? That's gonna like break the mood. That's gonna ruin the mood. And so I have this dorky slide called Consent is Sexy, right? And this is really about how in our society, we have a very like prudish culture around sex, right? Like we don't talk about sex. It's embarrassing to talk about it. It's embarrassing to talk about what the body does during sex, right? All of these things. And the reality is that if we are going to have good sex, that needs to be sex that we're communicating about what we like and what we don't like, right? Because we're all different individuals who have different boundaries and different comforts and different turn-ons and turn-offs. And so we have to communicate that. And if you are ever in a situation in which you don't feel comfortable communicating what you want to the person you're having sex with, maybe you shouldn't be having sex with that person, right? Because you want to be having sex with someone that you can be like, hey, I don't like that, or like, I like it when you do this, right? And if you don't feel comfortable, there may be something going on. There may be a power imbalance, and then there's not consent, right? So ways to make consent sexy is, right, like it's not like, do you want to engage in sexual activity with me? Yes or no, right? It can be like, I like it when you touch me here. Does this feel good? When I do this, does it feel good for you? What is your favorite safe word? Safe words are really important. Let's talk about it beforehand. I like it when it turns me on when you touch me here. Can I kiss you? How can I make you feel good? All of these are examples of ways we can make consent part of our conversation when engaging in sex. So it's not lame, actually. Okay. Okay, so we've talked about consent. We've talked about gender roles, and now I want to talk about what we can do and how we can support survivors, right? So if anyone ever tells you they've been sexually assaulted, it's really important. The 3 most important words you can ever say to someone who tells you they've been sexually assaulted is, I believe you, right? Because so much of our culture involves shaming, victim blaming, victims of sexual violence. So saying, I believe you, I'm meaning it, right? Like believing them, believing that maybe their story doesn't sound like what you've ever heard before, but it's still real, right? Listen without judgment. Don't be like, ooh, you were where? Like, oh, you went on a date with who? Right? Like, just really be there and listen. Bust some myths, right? So we've spent a lot of time talking about what is real and what is not a myth. So use that education you have with them. Validate them, right? Say like, actually, I've heard about rape trauma syndrome. It's a very common experience to have hypervigilance, to have disassociation, to feel nauseous, right? To not be able to eat. So validate everything they're feeling and saying, and share resources, right? Like, so we've shared our hotline with you. We share that hotline with you. You should probably put it in your phone, and just share it with anybody that ever needs it, right? And here it is again, screenshot this shit, right? Like have it ready to go. This is all the hotlines, 24-hour. And then in the last couple minutes, I just want to talk about like some barriers to reporting, right? So a lot of us don't report because of our lack of community belief in the police, right? So police aren't always the most helpful, aren't always the most supportive, and that's totally normal and fine to feel like you don't want to go to the police, right? Undocumented folks don't report for fear of being deported, right? LGBTQ folks don't report because they know that the response is usually based in homophobia, right? Like, a man can't rape you, right? Like, what are you talking about? Gang affiliated folks don't report because they might go into a station or call the police for support due to a sexual violence they've experienced, but then they're arrested for their gang involvement, right? If it's an acquaintance or partner, people still don't believe that that's something that's real, right? The only rape we kind of understand is stranger rape. Yeah, so there are a lot of different reasons people don't report. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it on this hotline and I'm gonna open up the Q&A. Okay.
12 Q&As.
Whew. All right, let's do this. Would grooming be a form of sexual harassment or abuse? So grooming is when an older person, usually with a younger person, right, like starts approaching them and like talking to them in order to eventually have sex with them or be their partner, right? Because again, like young folks are vulnerable populations. So that would be a form of abuse. Yeah, for sure. Grooming is a form of abuse. I mean, I'm sure it could be classified as sexual harassment, but it's more of an abuse, right? It's like manipulating, coercing someone. So yes. Hypersexual activity, if I didn't explain it right, that's when you have a lot of sex. So your response to being traumatized is to have lots of sexual partners or have a lot of sex very often. And so hypersexual activity act as a response, right? So like, of course, having lots of sex and having lots of sexual partners is totally fine and natural. But if it's in response, if you've never been someone who has lots of sexual partners and lots of sex, and then you're sexually assaulted, and you engage in hypersexual activity, that's usually a sign that you're trying to erase the negative experience, right? So some folks may be too scared to engage in sexual activity after a rape, right? Because like now sex has become kind of this traumatic, triggering experience. And then there's hypersexual activity, which is usually a response, like I said, to kind of like, I'm just gonna have lots of sex so that all the sex blurs into one and I forget the sexual violence that I experienced. Okay. Can you have, oh yes, can you have multiple reactions to sexual violence? Can the responses interchange? 100%, right? So like one day you can feel like you don't remember a lot, that you feel kind of numb and you're not feeling anything. And then the next day or in an hour even, you can become like overwhelmed with emotions and feelings, right? So yes, they can interchange, they can change over time, they can change throughout the day. And that's why getting healing services is so important, okay?
If somebody just said that they could have access to a PowerPoint after, and we usually do, right?
Yes, I can do that for sure. Okay. If you take back your police report, would they consider it a false accusation of rape? It doesn't really, like, that's not how it's usually categorized, right? Like there can be a number of different reasons. But yes, if you like report a sexual violence and then you say, you know what, I don't want to press charges, you actually have every right to not press charges, right? That's totally up to you. You decide if you want to press charges or not. But yes, they could consider it false, but that's also not your responsibility, right? You don't owe anybody shit. If you report something and then you take it back and you're worried, oh no, am I now gonna like add to the 2%? Fuck that, don't worry about it. Oh my God, there's more coming. Okay, can the impact of sexual violence affect a person for years? 100%. Sexual violence can affect you for the rest of your life, right? Which is why, again, healing services are so important. Getting a counselor, getting a therapist, finding what self-care works for you is so important. Did you want to say something, Luis?
Yeah, and this is a huge question because it affects people mostly throughout their lives, and it affects people to the point where they become perpetrators of sexual violence, and get caught up in addiction, become homeless, so on and so on. So the impacts of sexual violence are really serious in the long term, and most of the time they're so serious that the point where most people who perpetrate sexual violence are also victims as well, and they haven't gone through the correct healing patterns and healing steps. And it's why it's important when we talked about last week about understanding the healing and analyzing the cycle in order.
Yeah, it can be lifelong, right? But I also want to point out that people are very resilient, right? Like people can grow, and just because you've experienced some type of sexual violence does not mean that defines you, right? So be patient with yourself. Like healing takes time, but it won't necessarily, like that's not all you are. You're not just a victim. That's why we started using the term survivor, right? We use the term survivor because it's not something that it can be something that happened to you, but then you grow, right? So there's healing that can happen. Okay. The 3 things of why sexual violence happen is strict adherence to gender roles, lack of affirming sexualities, different types of sexualities and sexual expressions, and then consent. But you're gonna get the PowerPoints, don't worry. People who perform in clubs, lead people into a vulnerable state where they can experience sexual violence. Clubs. For me, when I hear the term clubs, and I don't know if anyone wants to clarify, but for me, like, do you mean someone who's a stripper, or do you mean someone who's a DJ? But any environment in which there is drinking, right? Because drinking can leads to you becoming vulnerable, right? Not being fully in control of what's happening to you. Yes, you can become more vulnerable, but I don't know if anyone wants to clarify. Okay. I've seen so many posts on Instagram saying no one can also, wait, I'm not reading properly. I've seen so many posts on Instagram that's like saying no one can also be saying let's do something else. But if you file a police report making a rape accusation, if you did not explicitly say no, it's like 90 times harder to convict. Okay, great question. So I've been talking about what consent is and what it is not, right? So like consent is not present when there's alcohol involved. Consent is not when you're under the age of 18. I'm talking about what consent actually is. Our legal system, right? That has a different relationship to sexual violence, right? The law is designed to be interpreted, right? So if you report a sexual violence and you say, I was under the influence, how many times have we seen that be using against you, right? Like, well, look at this slut, she was drinking, right? How dare she? Now, even though the law is, well, actually that makes you even more likely to be experience sexual violence. The law is a whole different thing, right? And I said 2% of reported rapes end up being false. Do you want to know something else? Only 1/3 of all people who experience sexual violence report it to the police. Only 1/3. So that's not a lot. And that's because people know it's very hard to accuse someone, right? And like get any type of serving time, which is why we have to also just move away from believing in a system of carcerality, right? Like of putting people behind bars. Putting people behind bars does not help anybody in this situation, right? We've talked about how power and control works, right? And like usually if you've experienced trauma, you're more likely to commit violence, right? I talked about in Roots of Violence how like 96% of people on death row were sexually abused as children, right? So like trauma leads to more trauma. And so putting someone in a cell never fixes anything, right? So while it's really frustrating that only 1/3 of rapes are reported, and it's really frustrating that only 2% of rapists will ever spend a day in jail, right? We also have to understand that jail is not the answer to any of this, right?
Yeah. And mostly because jails don't really address the problem, they just push it down the road, and we just put people in there and profit off them, and sometimes they're out. But it's also the way the jail racially works. For example, Brock Turner, he didn't do time enough like other people have because he's a wealthy young white guy. So, and that's the reason why jail can be a little bit iffy because how justice is.
Yep. And also sexual violence is pervasive in jails, right? So prison rape is a huge problem, right? And I don't support any type of violence, and I don't support people who are in jail being raped either, right? So if we actually want to stop sexual violence, we also have to work against police and against jails because, of course, police commit sexual violence, right? Anybody who has power is more likely to abuse that power, right? So again, like only not all states is it illegal for a cop to sexually assault someone they're convicting, right? Like in New York a few years ago, I don't know if y'all remember this, but a teenage girl was raped by a police officer who was arresting her, and it actually wasn't against the law, right? So everything's fucked, basically, is the answer. But that's why we're here having these conversations. Thoughts on anonymous Instagram accounts where people share their stories about sexual assault? Do you think they're a good idea? I think anything that helps someone who's experienced this type of violence is good, right? Whatever you need. Some people feel like they need to share their story, other people don't, right? And both responses are valid. So I think anything that someone feels like they need to do is okay. I ain't here to judge anybody's healing process, unless it's like my healing process is like murdering people, then I might judge it a little bit. What happens to the conversation of consent when all parties involved are not sober? A lot of college parties have both parties inebriated, so I kind of just want more information on this. Great question. This comes up all the time. I've taught at colleges a lot. I've taught in high schools, and everyone's like, well, what if when both people are drunk? Then both can have their consent violated, right? And again, I'm not saying every time two drunk people hook up, it's rape, right? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying if you hook up and you're drunk and you wake up going, you know what, I'm not okay with what happened to me, then that's your right, right? You cannot give consent when you're under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So both people, it doesn't matter, right? And ultimately, like what we usually say is like the person who's the least drunk is the most responsible. But that's why it's important to like have your support group and be careful about what you do, like when you're drunk, right? And like, it's okay, people get drunk and horny, that's totally fine, right? But maybe like take that fool's number and then sleep on it, and then do something later. I don't know, I don't have all the answers, but we're just here to talk about consent. Okay. Okay, yes means yes and no means no. What does no means no mean? So no means no usually, right, like was this message that was sent on college campuses a lot. And it basically, no means no says you can do whatever you want to a person until they say no, right? So And also what the no means no implies is that it's the person's responsibility to say no. Whereas yes means yes means it's both people's responsibility to get permission and ask for permission and listen to the permission, right? So it's more equal. Does that make sense? Okay. Nobody's been able to answer. Can you be so traumatized you don't know if it was a dream or if it actually happened? 100%, right? Especially if drugs or alcohol are involved, right? But even not when they're not, our brains are designed to protect us, right? So if we're ever experiencing something violent, our thinking brain, our prefrontal cortex shuts down, right? When our body goes into survival mode of fight or flight or freeze, that's our body like doing what it has to do to save us. So yes, we can get confused and we can get disassociative, and then people can gaslight us as well, right? And say, what are you talking about? So that is something that can definitely happen. Does protection occur when having sex? I don't really understand that question, so I'm gonna skip it. But if you want to clarify and put it in the Q&A again, that's fine. How can you support victims of pedophilia? The same way you can support any victim, right? We are here having conversations around sexual violence. We are part of the prevention team. We want to have these conversations so we can prevent this type of violence from happening in the first place. Talking to children about consent is hugely important when it comes to any type of pedophilia or anyone experiencing child sexual abuse. People think like, oh, we shouldn't talk to kids about consent. You can talk about consent to anybody, right? It's just about like what happens to your body is up to you. What are some ways supporters can actionize, verbalize our support? How can we call out sexual assault or abuse while still providing safety for the survivor? So first of all, one of the best things you can do is ask if it's someone specifically you're referring to, like ask them, what can I do to support you? What do you need from me? And then the other way is just, again, teaching consent. Go on your Instagram and post about consent, right? Say, this is what consent is, this is what it is not. Share this information. Also, you being here is you supporting your survivors, because you're here to learn and you're going to take this information and take it into your schools, into your community, and that's you already taking action. Okay. My school tried hiring a new diversity and inclusion vice president who was involved in the University of Michigan's Larry Nassar case. Okay, yes. What do we do if our school administration doesn't support us? So this vice president supported Larry Nassar. Wait, do you want to say something, Luis?
I mean, they're asking about what to do about that case, I guess.
So I think, the best thing is we can talk about this more, you and I individually, if you want, to learn how to get this person out, I guess, of your campus. Is it what you're asking? But
yeah, I guess organize your campus pretty much, and gather students that feel the same way and create petitions, create demands, create a petition to sign around the campus, and have a demand on why you don't want to support this, and then kind of escalate to, margin in meetings, whatever works, little by little.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Take Luis's organizing internship track. Is a great way. It's getting exposed sexual violence. Leaked nudes, yes, that is sexual violence for sure. If you send nudes to someone and they share them around, that is an abuse of your consent. They are violating your consent. You agreed. What you consented to was sending a picture to one person, and they violated that and shared it with other people. And also if you're under 18, sending nudes or soliciting nudes or sharing someone else's nudes is considered distribution of child pornography. So it's a very serious offense. Okay, so yes, you did mean strippers. So I'm glad you brought up the question of strippers. So strippers are considered sex workers, right? A sex worker is anyone who uses sex to make money. And we support sex workers here at Peace Over Violence, especially because sex workers are often experience sexual violence and then are not taken seriously, right? Because again, consent applies in sex work too. That is someone making the decision. I talk to you, you want a blowjob for $10. Oh God, I hope people are charging more. But right, I agree to do that for you. And then if you rape me, if you do more to me than what we agreed without paying me, then that's not the terms I agreed to, right? So consent is violated. But strippers, right? Like strippers actually are a great example of consent, right? Most strip clubs have very strict rules, right? So it's no touching, no even like texting near the stage, right? Like there are all these rules. And if you violate those, you're kicked out. No question, right? No defense. This isn't a jury room, right? And that's a great example of consent, right? This is someone who said, this is what I'm willing to do with my body, but this is what I'm not. And if you don't respect that, get the fuck out, right? So great example of consent. Okay, what can someone do if they share their story but are blamed for the situation or the person listening becomes angry and distant? Well, understand that that's very common, right? For some reason, people don't like believing victims. Stop talking to that person. Call the hotline, right? Like call people. There are people in this world who want to support you. So you don't need to waste your time with people who don't. And why that can be very triggering and upsetting, know that there are people out here who care about you, who want to talk about this. Call the hotline, etc. Okay. How do we initiate conversations about consent? I mean, just be like, hey, do you want to talk about consent? Like, what's consent? Like, have you heard about consent? You can talk about things in the news. You can post it on your Instagram, follow accounts that talk about consent. There are tons of different ways to talk about consent, and also join Lisa's organizing track. Oh, I'm going to skip to this question. How do you respond to people who try to say that women lie about their sexual assaults? Say that's not true, right? 2% of cases end up being false, and that's the same as any other crime. So 2% of burglaries end up being false. And just say people don't, right? Like, and also if people really don't believe you when you're telling them that women don't lie about rape, then you're wasting your time with that person, to be honest. Right? Women do not lie about rape. Why would they, when all they get is shame and violence and rape and death threats online? Why would you willingly bring that upon yourself, right? No one lies about sexual violence. Okay. Yoko asked an internship question, so I'm just going to answer this, but are we able to take multiple tracks? No, you are not. You have to take one internship track. They meet the same time, so you're going to have to pick wisely. Okay. That's all I have. Thanks everyone who stayed around, all 26 of you, I appreciate you. If you have any questions, you know I'll be back on Thursday to talk about rape and media and sexual violence. I'm glad this was helpful. If you have any questions, you know you can email us if you're willing to talk about the question. And if it's something you want to be anonymous, call the hotline. We love y'all, we support y'all. Thank you for listening. Do something nice for yourself. Join. We have a self-care activity this evening. That would be really good. There's also self-care activity on Wednesday, Healing Arts, for y'all who did that last time. It's really fun. So please do something that involves you looking after yourself. All right. Have a good one, everyone. Bye. Thanks for
Thank you.
monitoring. Bye.